Good morning. My name is Rebecca Sharp. I am an archive specialist, and I provide reference guidance at the National Archives in Washington, D.C. Welcome to the third day of the 2014 Virtual Genealogy Fair. A few quick notes before we get started. You can submit your question for a speaker via Twitter using hashtag GenFair2014 or YouTube chat. The speaker may not be able to answer all of the questions during the allotted 10-minute Q&A session. For captioning, go to the Virtual Genealogy Fair website and click on the link for today. The lectures will be recorded and posted on the Virtual Genealogy Fair website by the end of November. If you're following along from home, this is session number 12. The lecture is entitled FBI and the FOIA, 20th Century Family Research, and our speakers are Britney Crawford and Netisha Currie. The lecture provides a guide to obtaining records through the Freedom of Information Act, FOIA for short, using Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI case files, and how they can aid in uncovering family histories. By offering information on how to access FBI case files and examples from individuals' research, this lecture provides genealogists with resources that may aid in the search for personal stories within government records. Netisha is an archive specialist in textual processing, and Britney is an archivist in the Special Access and Freedom of Information Act branch. They both work at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland. And I am turning the microphone over to Britney and Netisha.
Thank you and good morning.
Good morning, I'm Britney Crawford, and this is Netisha Currie. And today we're going to present on FBI and the FOIA, 20th Century Family Research. So the goals for this presentation today is 1, to provide an overview of the 20th century FBI case files accessioned at the National Archives, to inform the genealogy of the family histories that exist in the FBI records, to provide step-by-step instructions on how to access FBI files released under the Freedom of Information Act, also known as the FOIA, and to share examples of family histories found in FBI records.
The session hopes to reveal new avenues of information that can be obtained from the FBI records. We would like to show how FBI case files can be a source for family history, and we would also like to expand the time frame of traditional genealogical research, bringing research up to the 20th century. Most records we will talk about are relatively recent compared to other clusters of records used by genealogists. And like the release of the 1940 census, researchers are now finding themselves in the historical record. So this will relate to that. Now I will go over an overview of the records of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. What is the scope of the FBI records? The documents at the National Archives reflect a broad investigative mission of the agency. FBI records reflect the scope and mission of the agency, which functions as a national security organization with intelligence and law enforcement responsibilities. The records are deposited at the archives, were created in the course of the work that the FBI did, such as investigations for the crimes shown, and these records were deemed permanent government records and will be kept at the National Archives forever. The first set of FBI records I'll go over are the case files. Here you'll find the bulk of genealogical research. These files tend to be case files where you can find the work of the FBI records. They're the documents that are created when the Bureau investigated individuals, groups of citizens, or any entity that was suspected or a victim of criminal activity. These files include such high-profile names as Albert Einstein, who was investigated because of his German origins, he was suspected of being a spy or sympathizer to German causes. Over time, the FBI collected 1,800 pages of material for him. Liberace also has a file worth 400 pages of material that were gathered after many of his valuable jewels were stolen and transported across state lines in 1974. The second set of records is the administrative files. These include records from the Office of the Director of the FBI, and they also have content about the origins and development of the agency. You also find personnel files of FBI agents. Administrative files include the records created by the founding director, J. Edgar Hoover, such as his official and confidential file, which is collected and separate for his special investigations on persons such as sitting and former presidents of the United States and civil rights leaders. These were sequestered away in his private office from the regular case files. The last set of records are the regional files of the U.S. attorneys. These records can be found in regional archives around the federal courts where cases were tried. And these files may be incorporated into files of other record groups, such as RG-21, the records of the District Courts of the United States, and RG-60, the Department of Justice. This is where researchers can go to learn the conclusion to an investigation or the records that they found in the case files. Now for going back into the case files, we're going to focus on the classes of the Bureau. The Central Records System is the records keeping system that many of the cases files under the FBI will fall under. CRS uses a numerical classification system to organize the records in classes. Some of the more relevant ones are shown here. When you request records through the FOIA, case files will have a classification number followed by a serial number. This is your case file number. We have selected 6 of the most commonly requested classes at the National Archives to go over in further detail. This slide is for a reference on how FBI files are arranged. All records in the Central Record System are arranged with a numbering scheme, and the numbers on the front page of the file are spelled out. To translate this FBI arrangement to what you'll find at the National Archives, you circle. The class file number the class number will equal a series at the National Archives, such as classification 157 for civil unrest case files. The case file number is an individual folder of cases that you'll find in a box. In this case here, it is 157-2438. The serial number are for the individual items and documents within that folder. In this particular case, this folder has 102 sheets in the folder. Series can also be grouped according to whether it came from a headquarters or a field office. And underneath that, it can also be separated into the textual records and then the bulky enclosures. Bulky enclosures are basically files that were either too large and oversized to fit in with a regular 8 by 11F piece of paper, or artifacts that were also just bulky. The first classification we'll go into in depth is the Class 31 for the White Slave Traffic Act. This was covered by the Mann Act from 1910, which prohibited transportation of women in interstate foreign commerce for purposes of prostitution, debauchery, or immoral acts. This is one of the most commonly requested case files. In these case files, lots of biographical material on women and involved socioeconomic data can be gathered from investigations into prostitution rings, also police corruption. Most of these case files have been declassified in bulk, and they're also available mostly on microfilm records. One of the most famous cases of the investigation that went to Jack Johnson, who was accused of transporting his girlfriend, who was becoming his wife, across state lines for immoral acts. Next class is Class 44 for civil rights. Many of these records this was established in 1924 for investigations for KKK activity, and the scope expanded to include violence against labor unions, racial disturbances, police, and prison brutality. Many famous cases include the 1967 Detroit riots, the 1968 Democratic Party convention in Chicago, and the murder of various civil rights workers. Or any investigation where a group or individual civil rights might have been violated, which also is a file on motorcycle gangs and how their rights were violated. In spite of the large cubic footage that is at NARA right now, the FBI still has a bulk of these civil rights files in their custody. Next is Class 65 for espionage. This is where Albert Einstein's file was for his suspected German ties. Notable cases in this class are investigations into Einstein, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg case was here, and after World War II, investigations started to those thought to sympathize with the USSR and Soviet bloc organizations. In this class, there is a lot of organizations are covered. If you're like a group of communists, young communists, or things like that, many of their files are here. Class 100 is for domestic security. The FBI were mandated to investigate organizations suspected of subversive activities, including communists, fascists, and Nazis. This became a very large part of the FBI's duties, especially in World War II and post-World War II with our Cold War and anti-Russian sentiments going on. It's also one of the most commonly requested records for FOIA at the National Archives. Groups included in this file are the German-American Bund groups, SNCC, the Students for a Democratic Society, and COINTELPRO investigations against protest groups were included in this file. They're very detailed and lengthy and contain info about German and Japanese spy efforts during World War II, German-American clubs, the Bund, German anti-Nazi refugees, and also Japanese aliens. Next is Class 105, the Foreign Counterintelligence. This classification has not been bulk declassified by the FBI, and therefore most of the files will require review or referral to the FBI. The records contain information for research about organizations as well as individuals, and document subversive activities as well as the activities of domestic and political social groups. The last class to go over is 157 for civil unrest. This was originally called racial and bombing matters, and also focused on activities of the KKK. There are investigations into bombings and bomb threats against racial, religious, or educational institutions, including the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church, which killed the 4 little girls in Alabama, the American Nazi Party and other anti-Semitic groups, and also attacks on civil rights workers. It was here that an investigation into the Black Panther Party was started in the North Carolina field office, and there are also investigations against the American Indian movement, Abby Hoffman and the Chicago 8, as well as the NAACP.
Okay, so next, the section I will talk about is the Freedom of Information Act. As mentioned previously before, the Freedom of Information Act is a statute that was enacted in 1966 and is required for requesters who are looking at or wishing to research a lot of the FBI records, case files in NARA's custody. They have to submit a Freedom of Information Act request in order to obtain these files. So just a little bit of backup. The purpose of the FOIA is to ensure informed citizenry vital to the functioning of a democratic society, needed to check against corruption and to hold the governors accountable to the governed. And for the sake of this presentation, when we say the informed citizenry, we're really talking about the genealogy, the historical public, researchers, people of that nature. And like I said, it was enacted in 1966. It applies to records of the federal executive branch, which includes the federal government agencies. It is composed of 12 sections, and a part of those 12 sections are 9 different exemptions that I'll cover a little later, but 9 exemptions that are relevant to those subsections. So for the sake of this presentation, we're just going to talk about 3 years that were made significant to FBI case files and the investigation and the release of information. The statute was enacted in 1966. However, from that time, there have been several amendments up until today, 2014, that have either broadened the scope of information and documents and information that's been made available to the public, but also has narrowed the scope, specifically in 1974, where there was an amendment to narrow the scope of law enforcement exemptions. And that's significantly important to the Freedom of Information Act as well as FBI case files, because initially the first 20 years, the FBI were only allowed or mandated to release certain policy manual documentations, but the actual investigative reportings were not necessarily covered within the first 20 years of the Freedom of Information Act. Also in 1986, there was an amendment that significantly broadened the scope of law enforcement records, which in turn made more information and documentation from the FBI agency available to the public. And then again in 2007, you had the Open Government Act, and that was really, really significant because here, again, we've seen a large initiative to make records more available to the public, but specifically in regards to the FBI records in NARA's holdings. As a result of those, what we call proactive disclosures from one of the previous amendments, we have records that were released into what FBI has called the FBI Vault, and it's basically an electronic reading room. And these two examples here are two documents that you can retrieve from the FBI Vault. And basically the FBI Vault contains documents, case files that they have already reviewed and since then have been subsequently reviewed. And they were proactively disclosing these case files up onto their websites so that the requesters and the research population did not necessarily have to file a FOIA, but they can log on to the FBI Vault page and you can access these case files for free. So the first example is a case file from Fannie Lou Hamer, a classification 45 case file. And it's basically, it's discussing a demonstration that was done in the 1960s, early 1960s, 1963 to be exact, where Miss Fannie Lou Hamer, she was a civil rights activist, she was arrested for not participating in a demonstration, but asking questions about the arrests that were made as a result of the demonstration. And then this just gives a little context about what happened in her arrest and things of that nature. The second example regarding Stokely Carmichael, this is a class 100 case file, and this is just an example of some of his actions and his initiatives that were investigated throughout his life. Now, the next section that we're going to cover is give some guidance on exactly how to file a Freedom of Information Act request. And that will be first with the FBI as well as with the National Archives. How to submit a FOIA request with the FBI. This portion is also included in this presentation because oftentimes a lot of requesters or genealogists, they come to us with a subject. And when I say us, I mean the National Archives. And we often have to refer them to the FBI. The FBI maintains index specific to different subjects. So what they would do is they would search for records based on a subject, and they have the capability to provide a case file number. The FBI case files that are in the National Archives custody are arranged numerically. So therefore, we will refer researchers to the FBI who have just a subject. Say, for example, if you were looking to investigate your grandfather and you do not have a specific case file number, we would suggest that you contact the FBI with that subject and they will provide you with a responsive case file number. You will then take that case file number and you will file a Freedom of Information Act request with the National Archives. So here is just an example of some of the information that you can include in your written request to the FBI. You will, of course, want to include your contact information, the scope of the records, and we ask that you try to reasonably describe. So any background information that you may feel will be helpful to the agency as well as helpful to yourself for you to get responsive documentation. Also, if you request any fee waivers, requests for expedited processing, you include that in your Freedom of Information Act request and you submit that to the FBI. You can do that at fbi.gov/FOIA/. And on the right side is just a sample document that we also refer requesters to of how to submit the request, basically a template that you would submit to that agency. The next example is specific to the National Archives. Again, we ask that most researchers start with the FBI if you don't have a case file number. But if you do have a case file number, then you can come to the National Archives and submit a Freedom of Information Act. And you will include pretty much the same information that you provided to the FBI, but it will be very, very important that you also include the case file number. And that, again, can be it has to be your classification, which can be, for example, class 44, and then your subsequent case file number. If you do have a volume or a serial number, you can also include that information as well. The next section is more information on the administrative process of the FOIA. And the FOIA, the Freedom of Information Act, we have 20 working days. Under law, we have 20 working days to respond to a FOIA. Now, most people may be aware of the backlogs that do occur. However, within the 20 working days, NARA, once you submit a FOIA request with NARA, we will process your request and we will provide you a response within 20 working days. Within that 20 working days, we complete a triage process where we will search for the case file that you requested, and then we will try to give you as much information about the file as possible, give you the information about the size. Also, what's important is whether that document, that case file number, is responsive or non-responsive. Now, a responsive document can be the specific case file that you requested, but also specific to your subject. A non-responsive document is a document that we view is not necessarily specific to what you have requested, in which in turn we will come back to you and ask you to clarify your search, or you can also contact the FBI for additional case file information. Within our triage queuing system, we will provide you with the triage response that includes the case file number and details. We will also place you in our case queue, and our case queue is based on the size of the file that you've requested. So currently we have 2 case queue systems, a smaller queue and then a larger queue. And then third, we will process the case and complete a case review. In the case review, you have 3 options depending upon your request type. Now, you can have a first-party request, a second-party request, and a third-party request. A first-party request is a person who is requesting their own file. So if you are searching for a particular investigation based on yourself being the subject of that FBI investigation, you would be a first-party request. And you would, in turn, have access to more information that, say, someone who submitted a third-party request. A third-party request would be someone unrelated to the subject. And then a second-party request can be a relative. So a lot of genealogy contains second-party requests because you may be looking for a relative of yours. And then the final stage is basically the public access. Once this file is released under a third-party review, it is available to the public, and we can release it electronically or in paper. Now, what you may find in these case files, my colleague, Netisha, she gave you a lot of information, specifically how the case files are arranged and some things that you may find. This discussion will basically be about some of the specific examples of things you may want to look for within the case files that you are researching. The first section will be the content section, and that will include the different document types. Say, for example, you will have photographs, you can have news clippings, you can have transcripts, things of that nature. You can also find subject information, and that's how you determine if this case file is responsive. Also a chronology, because these case files are arranged in reverse chronology order, so each document for the most part will have a date specific to that particular investigative report. The next part that is important are exemptions. Now, because the National Archives, we do maintain historical records, so the FBI case files that we do have in our custody will be considered historic once they're accessioned to our custody. However, there could be certain personal identifiable information concerns, and we call that PII. So we would have to review these case files for PII, and that would include Social Security numbers, birth information, certain physical information about different individuals or subjects within the case files. Another important component will be law enforcement information. Under the Freedom of Information Act, as I mentioned previously, some of the exemptions require us to make withholdings. And for the FBI case files, for the historical records, most of the withholdings that you may see will be a B6 or a B7 exemption. And a B6 exemption is for personal privacy. Again, like I referenced, some of the PII information. Also, the B7 exemptions will be specific to law enforcement records. So information may be protected, such as research methods and techniques of the FBI agency, also confidential source information of the FBI agency, or any identifiable information that may have been supplied that may violate the personal privacy of someone in that case file. The third section that is really important within the files, you can find a lot of cross-references within these FBI case files. The first set of cross-reference will be subjects. So you may look into a file, you may be researching your grandmother or your grandfather, but they can also reference other individuals as well as other organizations that your subject may have been affiliated with. So you can in turn get a case file number for those additional subjects and organizations. Also, specific case file numbers may be cross-referenced within these individual case files. I'll show you examples later, but each case file often include additional headquarters file numbers or field office file numbers within a specific file. So again, here are some of the examples that we're just going to cover. Example of a headquarters case file is here. And you can see that with the class 100, the number would be here. The classification comes first. And then depending upon the type of case file, you may also see that type, and you'll see that here. For this example, this is a class 100 headquarters file, which is abbreviated with the HQ, and then you have the case file number here. Now, this example is from the cover letter of each case file. Each case file has a case file cover, and it will look similar to this. And then you'll have subsequent arrangement numbers like your section, and then here you have the serial. Another example is you'll see the case file number within the file. So the lower example is an example from a document within a specific case file. And to identify what case file you are in, you're looking at this subject information, is director and FBI. Often that's a clear indication that that is the headquarters file. And then you have that case file number here with the classification and then the subsequent file number. A different type of example would be the field office file. And the field office file, the case number arrangement is the same because you'll have the case file number, the classification, and then you'll have the case file number, but you'll also have the field office. And the field office is basically the state. So for example, in this particular document, this is a field office file for New York. And you can have that field office that precedes the classification, or oftentimes it may come after the classification number. And an example within the document again is you will get normally at the bottom lower half of the document, you may also get that specific field number identified at the bottom, and then you'll see a case file number near that field office. So for another part of the content, you will get the subject. And the subject, of course, is going to be very, very important in your research because as archivists, when we're reviewing a case and determining what's responsive, we always look at the subject to see does it match our case file. Oftentimes in historical research, you may have a case file number, but you also may have a separate subject. And that basically means that there can be a larger case file for, say, an organization, say the SNCC organization, but you are only looking for your relative. So it will be important to identify what the overall subject is and try to identify a case file specific to your subject so that you can easily identify the person that you are researching. In this example, this subject is Thomas Dickens, and this is just information concerning the major subject, and that's always going to be identified in most memo documents with the subject, and you'll see that. The next set is going to be the chronology, and that's just the date that you'll see at the top of each page. Okay, the examples of document types. Here are just three examples. This came from a case file, all from a subject, from the same subject. And again, this was a letter. Initially, it was a handwritten letter, and then we had a translation in Russian, so that was typed. The handwritten letter was in poor condition, that's why you don't see it. But it also included a photograph, which is also helpful for family history, and also a Washington Post news clipping. So it talks about this subject and the work that he did in this news clipping. Okay, further examples for classifications will be in class 31, and these are just documentations, and you'll get that chronology, that subject here, and then you get that date. And then on the class 44, this is just an example from class 44, and you'll see what classification that you are in, and that's here, class 44, and then the case file number there. And this is specific to the document we talked about earlier, where we talked about Fannie Lou Hamer and class 44 file. Other examples here are just class 25 and classification 100, which is a large set of records that we do have in our custody at the National Archives. So these are just examples of how the documents may look once you get into the case files, and then you will read within to get the content from the case file. Again, additional examples will be classification 105. This is an example here, and this is the case file. This is the Washington field office. And then you have class 157, which is a cover sheet to this particular report. Now, the exemption sections, you have your B6 and your B7C. B6, again, is personal privacy, and this is just a particular withholding, example of a withholding that was made. And then B7D, which is the source code information. So you may also see this. This is just FBI source code information that was just protected from this document. This is an example here of a cross-reference. Again, as I mentioned, the subject of this is Elder Solomon, but you have the different reference case files. You have a class 62 that's referenced, a class 100 that's referenced, and additional ones there at the bottom. Also, another example of cross-references would just be memo sheets, and sometimes the FBI, they made a list of additional case files that were specific, and then they will provide them here. This one here is really, really important because Alderman Solomon that we mentioned before, the researcher who was researching his file found a connection between him and Elijah Muhammad and Elijah Muhammad's wife, and he was able to do that with the cross-reference list in that document. Now, this right here is just an example of some of the research requests that we do get. We had a gentleman who was looking to see if his grandfather was a secret spy, and this is just his request. And this is his file number, the specific file number he requested. And as a result of that, he was able to put some pieces together, and this is what he provided to our agency as a family tree. And again, this is the content that we provided for his interpretation as a result of his request, and this was a signed letter from his great-grandfather within that document. Now I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Currie, and she'll give an example of her family history.
Thank you. So this is a quick overview of a FOIA success story I've had personally about I requested my grandfather's case file that was in class 157. And my family lore was a story of when the time that the KKK burned down the family house, which was in Currie settlement in Ellisville, Mississippi. The families have been living there since about 1910, and in this large expanse of farmland, which my grandfather and his brothers had all parcels of land. This farmland is outside of Ellisville, Mississippi, and leading up to the house burning, which is what the FBI file covers, there were a few incidents of run-ins with the KKK in the early 1960s. During Freedom Summer, COFA workers were stationed in Ellisville and Laurel, Mississippi, And at the end of that summer, the family had a kind of barbecue and picnic out in the field to celebrate the COFA workers helping people register to vote in the county. And unfortunately, the picnic ended with a shootout against the KKK. A few months after that, there was the first attempt to burn down the family home of Brule Currie and Florine Currie, whose portrait is pictured there. The story had been told by mostly my father, who was present, and my aunts and uncles, who were in the house. But a lot of questions remained because it was such a quick incident, a traumatic incident, and really immediate in time. And they were all teenagers when it happened. So as time went on, they kind of forgot when exactly this happened. They had different perspectives of what actually happened. And since no one was ever persecuted or tried for the crime of burning down the house, no one knew for sure who or why they did it. This is a picture of the home of Brule Currie in March of 1965 after the first attempted house burning. When we requested the FOIA file, which is the Class 157 file, lots of questions were answered. Who was the KKK Ellisville Clavern? And it happened on October 11th, 1965. Yes, that's the serial number 2438. And why it was retaliation for the COFO incident with the picnic that ended in a shootout. There is a picture of the house after it burned down, and a statement from an FBI informant is what revealed that the KKK had been planning for some time for this act of retaliation since one of their members were actually hit in the shootout at the farm. We also found out what happened in a lot more detail than we had known before. There's two statements I have here. One is from Billy Roy Pitts, who was a Klan member, who was giving a deposition after he was convicted of the crime in the murder of another civil rights worker in a nearby Hattiesburg, Mississippi. After this, he was already in custody. He started giving up more information about other incidents he had taken part in, and he gave a full statement about the night of October 11th and how they went out to the house and covered the space in lighter fluid and threw kind of a firebomb. And it also revealed, which we had never known before, that my grandfather had actively defended and protected his home in shooting at the KKK members, which is kind of out of character for what we knew my grandfather as, who was a kind of tall and gentle man. So we got his perspective on that as one of the people who were inciting the incident. And then there's also a statement from my grandmother, Florine Currie, who provided her perspective, which is very telling of like her personality. It talks about how she got the kids out safely, and then they went back into the house and went to save anything that they could. The last thing she said was that they had lived in that house for 24 years prior to this incident. There's also lots of other statements from neighbors along the road and witness statements and things that were collected in the days after, all within this file. So after the house burning, it took about a year to rebuild the other house that stands there today, which my grandfather lived in. Both my grandparents lived in for a long time. We still are on, it's now called Currie Road at Currie Settlement. And they were able to move back into the house a year later, and the family continued to live out their days there. So that's kind of a quick rundown of my personal FOIA request story, and we hope that the information we gave here today would provide genealogical researchers with any information they needed to make their FOIA process easy and less painful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So we will now open the floor to any questions.
Netisha, you have several questions that have come in from your online audience. The first one is, what is the date the FBI records began?
There's no specific records because we do have records going. The earliest, I believe, we have them going back into the 1930s in our custody. They started the initial transfer They started with looking at records that went all the way back to the 1940s, but I often review case files that go back into the 1930s.
And there are FBI predecessor agencies that have records of this type that were not by the FBI specifically, but kind of in the same function. So it could go back to the 1920s even.
Your next question is, did the FBI investigate German fraternal organizations such as the Sons of Hermann or the Turnverein gymnastic clubs?
I have not come across those specific subjects, but it will definitely be worth submitting a request for it, but I'm just not familiar with those particular subjects.
Yeah, they might be included in the Bund groups that were in the classifications for domestic security and foreign counterintelligence. They could possibly be found there.
And a follow-up to that question is about how large might some of those files be?
Well, we tend to find the organizational files are the larger files, so I've seen case files that are up to 10 to 15 different specific boxes, so that can be over 50,000 pages at least for the organization. It depends on the organization, and the headquarters files are normally larger than the field office files, but there's normally an overlap between the two case files.
Your next question is, did the FBI investigate the Detroit 1967 riot?
There was an investigation, and then we will also encourage you to file a request for it to get that information on it.
I have a note, there was a file at least in class 44, which they would have investigated for the victims of the riot, their civil rights being violated. So not the riot specifically is a case file necessarily, but the riot will be covered
Individual
in
investigations.
Did the FBI question my family members in the early 1950s? It has to do with my grandfather, but I don't know why. FOIA requests to FBI came back negative. Can NARA search by subject's name without a case number?
We cannot do a complete search without a case file number at this time. It could be true that there was an investigation that resulted in a case file. However, it would have been the FBI who determined that record temporary or permanent, and that record could no longer be permanent by the time it reached the National Archives. In that case, the National Archives wouldn't have a case file either way. So if you did get a non-responsive response from the FBI, it's a possibility that that case file no longer exists.
I understand that you need to go to the FBI first, search by subject, get the case number, then go to NARA with that number to request case contents. Can you search by person's name or surname at the FBI, or must it be an event or topic?
Yes, you can submit a request to the FBI for a subject. I would also encourage you to search their FBI vault that we mentioned earlier by a specific surname and see if you can find information within that electronic reading room.
Yeah, like my grandfather's file, we asked just for files with his name, and it just happened that the file is in his name. So you probably will find success with the more information you give.
Right. They can give you a list of case file numbers, and sometimes those case file numbers are specific to your subject, but they can also be pertaining to other subjects where your surname is mentioned.
Your next question is, my grandmother's brother was a bootlegger during Prohibition. Did the FBI investigate all bootleggers?
I cannot confirm that. However, there are investigations of what were considered bootleggers.
Do files exist for labor disputes or union activities?
Yes, we do have files that exist. I've reviewed some of them myself. You can probably search in class 44 for some of that information. If you do get responsive documents, they may come from classification 44, which is specific to civil rights.
You said that the cases you release records on become public access. Does that mean that for those records, no one else needs to file a FOIA to access it?
That's only if it was a third-party release. If it was a first-party release, which is a request released to the person who's on the subject, then yes, you will have to submit a third-party or second-party release. But if it was released as a third-party release, then it'll always be publicly available to the public.
Are bombings checked by the FBI, and would there be files? This event happened in the 1930s.
There is a possibility, and there would definitely be files. There are two possible classifications. Maybe in class 157, you may want to search that, or you might want to check class 100.
My grandfather translated for a German POW camp in Minnesota during World War II. Would the FBI have information on him?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that question?
Sure. My grandfather translated for a German POW camp in Minnesota during World War II. Would the FBI have information on him?
Yes, that is a possibility that it may be a investigation file on him or specific to a larger investigation where that relates to it.
The next question. I'm confused about where we do our initial search for case numbers regarding our ancestors. We do the search for a case number on the FBI site?
Well, you would submit your initial search. You can submit your initial search to the FBI, and in their response, if they found responsive documents, they will provide you with that case number. But you can also, if you are looking at a case file number that's in the NARA file, the file that you got from the National Archives, the cross-reference documentation may include case file numbers. But if you had any additional questions specific to how to request with the FBI, we would refer you to the FBI website on how to file a FOIA.
Your next question. Does the FBI investigate cases involving bigamy? If so, under what subject number do they fall?
There is a possibility, and in this instance, we will refer you to the FBI. But there's also, I do want to mention, there's also a really good resource, the Guide to the FBI Records, that contained specific information about the FBI, their different types of investigations, and also each classification. They have the FBI released a report that they worked with the National Archives to publish, and it breaks each classification down and gives you specific subjects and main content for each classification. So I will refer you to those two resources to get context on your specific research topic.
And the link to the FOIA guide is on our handout, and we can't say specifically which classification will have what in it. There are over about 250 or 300 classifications right now, so that would be a good resource.
Could you please repeat the URL for the FBI?
To file a FOIA?
Yes.
Okay, it will be www.fbi.gov/FOIA. That's FOIA /, and it's also included on our handout.
Does the FBI have case files for missing persons?
Yes, that is. They do have case files for missing persons, and again, we will refer you to the guide for this specific classification.
Thank you, Britney and Netisha. If the speakers did not get to your question, please send an email to inquire@nara.gov. We will now have a short intermission.